Hey YouTube, Ed here with Jack of All Trades, and welcome back to another video. So a question I get a lot from customers, friends, YouTube subscribers, you name it. Hey, I just bought this new rifle. What kind of rifle scope should I put on it? So we're going to take a few minutes today and we're going to talk about the basics of rifle scopes, what you should really look for when purchasing a rifle scope, and what kind of rifle scope would best suit your needs. That all being said, this is a beginner's guide to rifle scopes, and I want to be fair to everybody out there. If you've been shooting for a number of years or things of that effect, you may not want to sit through this. Please, by all means, feel free to do so. Let me know if I provided any incorrect information so I can fix it. I'm human, and I can make mistakes too, but this is a beginner's guide to rifle scopes. So with that, let's relocate the camera, and let's get into talking about rifle scope basics. Welcome back. So when we're getting into talking about rifle scopes, the first thing you really kind of have to do is you have to talk about the classifications or various types of rifle scopes. And I generally like to break it down into about 5 categories. The first category is basic target shooting. You just want to go to the range and you either want to plink some pop cans or you just want to shoot targets in general. Then you have a classification of scopes which are more generally suited towards hunting and things of that effect. Then you have another classification of precision rifle shooting, and they are in their own group and classification to be sure, because the scope that you're going to use for precision long range is certainly not going to be the same kind of scope you're going to use to shoot pop cans in the backyard of the farm. You have your tactical type scopes, which are scopes that are used in more tactical style scenarios, close quarter combat, things of that effect. And then you might have a home defense type scope, or a scope which would be considered like a red dot or a holographic or a fast reflex fire scope. And that kind of melds into the tactical realm, but you could also break it off into its own category. So now that we've kind of broken down some categories of scopes, let's go ahead and let's talk about the various parts of the scopes. And let's also talk about what some of the things are that you see on the outside of the box, the numbers and all the marketing and the terminology, so that it doesn't lead you astray and it helps you make a good informed decision. Okay, all scopes basically all have the same parts for the most part, and when you're talking about the parts that you can see on the outside of the optic. And we're going to go from left to right on this particular scope. This is a Vortex Diamondback Tactical. As you see my channel more and as you watch more of my gun videos, you're going to come to the realization that I really like this scope because I use it a lot. But we're going to go from right to left here, and why we're going to go from right to left is this part of the scope is actually the part that's going to be closest to your eye, and this part of the scope is actually going to be the scope that's closest to the muzzle or the target. So starting from the eye side or the left side of the scope, the first thing that you're going to come into here is you're going to come into the eyepiece. And the eyepiece is really the first portion of the scope, and it's also, you're going to come into the ocular bell. The eyepiece is going to house quite a few components. The first thing it's going to house is going to house the first piece of glass, or the ocular lens. That's the first piece of glass that you're going to peer through as you enter the scope. The eyepiece itself, like on this particular model, is oftentimes adjustable, so you can actually focus the eyepiece to, or focus the scope to your eye. You're going to get into the ocular bell, and then you're going to get into this right here, which is called the power ring. And if you've got a variable power scope, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, this is where you actually adjust the magnification of that scope. This particular scope is a 3 to 9 power, so I can adjust the scope from 3 power all the way up to 9 power to increase my magnification. Then as you travel further down the scope, you're going to come into the body, and the body is actually this whole portion of the scope right here. These bodies of these scopes basically come in two sizes for the most part, two most popular sizes, 1 inch and 30 millimeter. There are some other sizes out there before anybody starts beating me up in the comments. I know there's 33 millimeter, I know there's 35 millimeter, but the most common sizes are 1 inch and 30 millimeter. Inside the body, you're going to come into the portion of the scope that has your windage and your elevation adjustments. Now, this particular scope has got tactical turrets on it, which they're all exposed. You can see all the numbers. You can make adjustments without tools, without taking any covers off. But these are where your windage and your elevation adjustments are. Elevation is always, always, always the top turret. Windage is always the side turret. You'll notice that this scope has the ring still mounted to it. I did this on purpose so that you could see scope rings, because this is not part of the scope, but it is part of the scope system, and you're going to need to have a set of rings to mount it to your particular firearm. You get out to here, this is what's called the objective bell, and this lens on the end, or the piece of glass on the end of the scope, is what's called your objective lens. So those are your basic parts of your scope. Like I said, all scopes will have basically the same parts that you can see. They just may look very, very differently. For instance, you have this low power variable optic scope. It obviously looks very, very different than the Vortex Diamondback Tactical in many respects, but in many respects it's also very much the same. All right, now that we've talked about the various parts of the scope, let's talk about some of the numbers you're going to see on the outside of the box and what they mean. Again, we're going to use the Vortex Diamondback Tactical for no other reason than the fact I still had this box. I hadn't thrown it away yet. So let's get right into some of these numbers right here. This says 3 to 9 by 40. Well, what does that mean? Well, the 3 to 9, these first sets of numbers here always mean your power range. This particular scope has an adjustable magnification range from 3 to 9 power. Now, there are scopes out there that are fixed powered, i.e. they do not have an adjustable power range, and that first set of numbers will be just a single number. It'll either be a fixed 4 power or a fixed 2 power or even a fixed 1 power. They just have a single number there because they are not adjustable. It is just a fixed power. By 40, what does that mean, by 40? Well, the number 40 in this particular instance is referring to the size of the objective lens, the big lens on the end that's closest to the muzzle or the target. This particular objective lens happens to be 40 millimeters in diameter, and this can be various numbers. You can have an objective lens as small as 24, like on this low power variable optic. This has got a 24 objective lens, and that number can also be as high as 50, 55, or even bigger in some of the more expensive precision long-range optics. But that number there always tells you the size of the objective lens of the scope. So if you look on the side of the box, there's a lot more information here that this particular scope manufacturer gives you, and there are some things that I want to point out and draw your attention to. One is the tube size. It always tells you what the tube size is of your scope. This particular scope happens to be a 1-inch tube. Well, why does that matter? That matters because you need to know what size rings to purchase for your scope so you can mount it to your rifle. If you have a 1-inch tube, 30 millimeter rings will not work. If you have a 30 millimeter tube, 1-inch rings will not work. So you need to be able to determine that. Eye relief. We're going to talk about eye relief after a little bit, but this is a very important number. Eye relief is the distance your eye has to be from the ocular lens. This particular scope has a 3.9 inch eye relief, or almost 4 inches. I generally recommend absolutely no less than 3 inches of eye relief, just so you can avoid something called scope bite or scope eye. Field of view is pretty self-explanatory. Adjustment and graduation. This adjustment graduation is actually a fairly important number, and this particular one is 1/4 MOA. And without getting too deep into the weeds on what MOA is, this particular scope, what that's telling you is that every click you make on your windage or elevation knobs, it will equal 1/4 of an inch of movement of your bullet strike at 100 yards. So quite obviously, if your target is out at 100 yards and you need to move your scope 1 inch to the right, you would make 4 clicks in the right direction to get your bullet strike to move that 1 inch. Now, the other thing you might find here is it may say MRAD, which is milliradians. If I was you, just as a beginner scope buyer, I would try to avoid milliradians. That's something that the military uses a lot. A lot of precision shooters use millrads, and millrads are just not the most common thing out there. It's becoming more and more popular with the precision guys, but for now I would just stick with MOA. When you get done watching this video, I would also watch a couple of videos on what exactly MOA stands for and what you can use it for. All right, now that we've got the basic terminology down and we understand a little something about scopes, let's talk about what you should look for when you're purchasing a scope. There are several things that I generally like to look for when I'm purchasing a scope. First and foremost is the quality, and the quality can actually be determined in a couple of ways. There are some things you can do right in the store, but there's some homework that you can do before you even get to that point. The first thing I like to do is I like to look at the reviews. And now you have to kind of take reviews with a grain of salt, especially if you're buying online. You're always going to get that one Karen out there that you just can't please. And they're going to give it a 1-star review because they didn't like the packaging or something like it's going to be something silly. So you kind of have to weed out some of those less than favorable reviews. Usually if somebody gives it 1 star, and they're like the only ones that give it 1 star, and it's got an overall rating of maybe 4 stars, you might have to take that review with a grain of salt. A lot of what you can determine with quality too is brand reputation. There are a lot of brands of scopes out there, and it is not difficult to do with the day and age of the internet and with reviews and product and blogs and things like that and product information out there to determine which brands are better than others. You obviously have some very inexpensive and cheap brands, and you also have some very good brands and some very expensive brands. Incidentally, that brings me to my next point. Price is oftentimes very synonymous with quality. If you buy a cheap $30 or $50 scope, that's exactly what you're going to get, is a cheap $30 or $50 scope. If you buy a $500 scope, that's obviously going to be a much far better quality scope. Now, there is a threshold there. There gets to be a point where you're going to spend a certain amount of money and you're really not going to gain a lot in quality, but more than anything, you're going to gain features and a very specific niche style functionality. For instance, your scope that you're going to buy for deer hunting is obviously going to be of a much different classification and quality of scope that you're going to maybe buy for precision long-range shooting. For precision long-range shooting, you can spend thousands and thousands of dollars on a rifle scope. You obviously aren't going to need that to go deer hunting. It's just not necessary. So there is a limit as to when the quality starts to not be a benefit the more money you spend. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another good resource for determining quality is friends. You might have a buddy who's got that same scope that you're looking at. Call him up. Ask him, hey, how do you like that scope? Has it been good for you? Has the durability been good? How do you like it in general? The next place you can go is YouTube. We're obviously on YouTube. There's plenty of platforms out here on the internet that were guys just like me who are doing product reviews. In fact, I've got a scope product review in my YouTube channel, several of them, quite honestly. And it's just a really good place to glean some information. Now, there again, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. You're going to always get that one Karen out there that you just can't please. And there's a couple of YouTube content providers out there that I think are just exactly like that. But you'll be able to determine that for yourself. All right, the next thing I like to look for when I'm purchasing a scope is the eye relief. Eye relief is fairly important, and we discussed it just very briefly in the earlier part of this video on what eye relief is. But eye relief, what to review is the distance between your eye and the ocular lens. And why is that important? If you're shooting a high-powered rifle, let's say you're shooting a deer rifle or an elk rifle or something like that, and it's a high-powered rifle, and you've got a really small eye relief, and your eye has to be very, very close to that scope so that you can see the full field of view in your lenses, you run the risk of something called scope bite. And what scope bite is when you squeeze the trigger and the rifle goes off and you have that recoil, that inherent recoil, the scope can actually come back and it can contact your forehead or your eyebrow or maybe even your eye itself. And I've seen guys that have actually required stitches due to scope bite because they didn't have enough eye relief on their scope, and it came back and it bit them when they fired the rifle. Sometimes that's also attributed to the fact that the guy didn't know what he was doing and he had just had his eye way too close to the scope and it didn't need to be. There is some of that as well. But eye relief is actually kind of critical for things like scope bite, just so you don't have to have your eye so close to the scope. And also, a longer eye relief gives you a few more options on how far forward or back you need to mount that scope, so that when you shoulder the rifle, it's in a comfortable position for you. The next thing I like to look at is clarity. Clarity of a scope is one of the most important things that you can possibly look for. And really, the best way to determine clarity is to go to the store and put the thing up and look at it. You know, that's one of the first thing almost everybody does when they look at a scope. Is the first thing they do is they look at it, you know, and they look through it. Well, a good portion of those people don't even know what they're really looking for. They're really probably looking at the crosshairs to see if the crosshairs look cool, you know, whatever. What you're looking for when you look through the scope is clarity. Now, you also want to determine that the crosshair is something that you like and you want to use, but the clarity of the lenses is really what you're looking for, and you can very easily determine that when you look at a cheaper scope and a more expensive scope. You can see that there's a very big difference in clarity. So you want the clearest, most sharp picture that you can possibly get out of the scope, and you can do that right in the store. Functionality. Functionality is another thing that you need to determine on your scope. Now, like this scope here, this Vortex Diamondback Tactical, this has got actually target turrets on it, which are completely finger adjust, and you can do a lot of things with this scope on the fly. But this scope might not have the same kind of functionality that you need for your scope. Say you want a deer hunting scope. Well, you don't need target turrets for a deer hunting scope. Most deer are killed within 300 yards. Let's just face it. There's not a lot of people out there shooting long-range deer, and you don't need target turrets or tactical turrets to deer hunt. So the functionality of a deer hunting scope could be very, very different than a tactical scope. This particular scope is a tactical scope, and I actually do hunt with a scope like this, but I do it with coyotes, and I'm oftentimes shooting at coyotes at various ranges beyond 300 yards, and it's often nice to be able to dial in some elevation for that. Or if I'm dealing with a wind, I live in North Dakota, and a day without wind around here is like a day without sunshine. I might want to dial in just a few MOA of windage to deal with some wind on those longer range targets. But you need to look at the functionality and what you're going to require in a rifle scope. You may or may not need rifle or target turrets. You may or may not need a variable adjustable scope that goes from 3 to 9 power. Maybe a fixed power scope would serve you just fine. Or maybe you don't need a scope that goes all the way to 9. Maybe you only need to go to 6 power because your distances aren't going to be that far, and a 9 power scope isn't necessary. You kind of have to determine in your own mind what you need as far as functionality in the scope, and then get the scope that is going to be the most functional for your situation. All right, finally, let's talk about first focal plane and second focal plane. And I'm going to keep this brief because in truth, this could really be a video in and of itself. But as a beginner scope buyer, you really don't care about the minutia of it. You just need to know the basics. So what is first focal plane and second focal plane? Well, let's first talk about second focal plane. Second focal plane is most of your scopes out there. Just about every scope on the shelf, with the exception of a few, are going to be second focal plane. It's the same style of scope that they've made since scopes have become a thing. And what is it? So basically, to best describe it, if you've got a variable power scope and say it's adjustable from 3 to 9 power, and you go from 3 to 9 on your power setting, the picture in your scope grows. It gets bigger because your magnification is increasing. However, the crosshairs or the reticle are going to stay exactly the same. They do not increase as you turn the power up. First focal plane is just exactly the opposite. As you turn the power up, the picture grows and the reticle grows in scale and proportion with the picture. Why is that important? Well, for a beginner scope buyer, it's really not. If you are a precision long-range shooter, or you are a long-range hunter, first focal plane might be of some use and advantage to you. But as a beginner scope buyer, that's not going to be of much advantage to you, and I'm just going to end this by saying stick with second focal plane. That's all you need. All first focal plane is going to do is it's going to drain your wallet faster. The other thing first focal plane is going to do is it's going to make you mad, because if you're hunting, for say, and you're only 100 yards away and you don't have your power turned all the way up, the crosshair and the reticle is going to be so small in your picture, it's going to be very, very difficult to use because it's hard to see. And especially if you're getting to be an old man like me, whose eyes aren't quite so good, that first focal plane reticle on low power is going to be just about useless to you because it's going to be so small, you're not going to be able to see it. So for now, just stick with second focal plane. If you want to learn more about first focal plane, I will post a couple of links to other YouTube videos that do a very good job of describing it, and you can learn more about it there. All right, so now that we've gotten through all that yucky stuff, let's answer the question. What scope should you buy? Well, that's really a tough question to answer definitively, and it really depends on a lot of factors. What kind of gun you're putting it on, what your purpose and intent of the scope is going to be for, what your price range is. All of these factors go into play. So what kind of scope you should buy for your rifle has to fall within the parameters that you've defined previously. First off, what kind of firearm are you going to put it on? Second off, what's your intended purpose? Third, what is your price range? And if you can find a scope that falls inside of all of those parameters, that's the scope you should buy. It might be different for everybody. Maybe you need a red dot scope because you're just buying the rifle for home defense and that's all you're going to use it for. Maybe you need to buy a deer hunting scope like this Leupold VX2, which is on my deer hunting rifle. This exactly fills the prescribed need. It fell within my price range, and it does everything I need it to do as far as functionality is concerned. Maybe you need an LPVO scope, low power variable optic, which might serve two purposes. It allows you to take the firearm hunting and also would serve as a very good home defense optic if you are going to do that, or a tactical optic of some sort. Maybe that's what you need. Maybe it's a 3-9 by 40 Vortex Diamondback Tactical, or maybe it's a Vortex Viper PRS, or God only knows what you're going to need it for. It just depends on what your specific application is going to be for. So when you're discussing what kind of scope should I buy for my rifle, you need to determine the parameters, determine your price point, and go from there. Very good example. This is my 22 long rifle, bolt action. All this gun does is dispatch skunks and woodchucks at the cabin, and my daughters use it for pop can plinking in the backyard of the cabin when we're up there doing that kind of thing. Do I need a $300 scope on this rifle? Absolutely not. Do I have a $300 scope on this rifle? Not even close. This is a 3-9 by 40 millimeter Tasco. I paid $45 for it. I know I bought it at a Walmart. Don't beat me up for that. But you know what? It does exactly what I need it to do. This thing has been the demise of many a skunk and woodchuck. It's never missed, and it functions absolutely perfectly for what I need it for. And you know what? If my kids are out in the backyard of the cabin shooting pop cans with it, and it gets dropped or tips over or whatever, they didn't just wreck my $300 scope. They wrecked a $35 or a $40 scope, and I can go buy a new one and throw it on there and accomplish the same thing. Will that change? Maybe someday I might put a more expensive scope on it, but for now I don't need to. It fulfills my needs. It fulfills my purposes. At the time, I wasn't willing to spend more than $50 on a rimfire scope, and it does exactly what I need it to do. Don't get all wrapped up in what the sales guy is telling you or what you see on the Outdoor Channel, because those people are all marketing people, and their job is to do one thing: sell you something that is overpriced, that you really don't need, and probably isn't going to work anyway. So just buy what you think that you need to have to get that firearm to function and do the intended purpose that you wanted it to do. With that, let's wrap this video up. Please, you'd be doing me a huge favor by smashing that like and subscribe button down below. Make sure you ring that notification bell so you get notified of upcoming videos, and hit me with comments. I love the comments. I love interacting with my subscribers, and I appreciate all of my subscribers and all the comments I get, and it helps me out with the YouTube algorithms. Make sure that you hit my Amazon influencer store. Check out what I've got in there. Everything I sell on my influencer store, I get a little bit of a commission on, and it helps the channel. Helps me do things like buy ammo and buy tools and buy parts and do some little projects. I've got a couple of projects coming up next. I'm going to take a break from the gun videos for a little while, and we're going to do some projects. One kind of fun one, I'm going to add turn signals to my ATV. That's coming up. So I've got a couple of projects like that we're going to do. So make sure you hit that notification bell so that you get notified of when those videos come up. With that, this is Ed from Jack of All Trades. Thank you for stopping by, and we will see you on the next video.